There we go. All right. Well, good evening. We're glad to have everybody here. We are picking up just a couple of verses into Hebrews chapter 11. We'll be beginning at verse 8 tonight. But let's start with just a quick word of prayer, and then we get to dive right back into the stories of the saints. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the saints that have been able to gather this evening in order to study and remember your saints of old, to be formed by the faith that you formed in those who we hear about, and from that now form in us by that same Spirit. We ask you to bless us in understanding and wisdom as we study this word. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All righty. So, last time we dove in a little bit to the beginning of this chapter, and Hebrews 11 gives us some of the list of the saints, or the catalog of saints. And we kind of walk through, starting with Cain and Abel, because that's where this starts. And we walk through Enoch into Noah. And so tonight we pick up with kind of the next major portion of the story. Now, there's obviously some time that goes on between Noah and Abraham, right? There's at least a couple of generations there. One of the reasons that it appears that the author here has done this kind of break is that he is highlighting the major figures in the same way as they're highlighted in the book of Genesis. So if you kind of go through the book of Genesis, you'll see there's a particular focus on Cain and Abel. Then there's a particular focus, just a little bit, on Enoch. And then again, there's several chapters that focus on Noah. Then you have a little bit more some other post-flood things. That's where you get the Tower of Babel. And then once you have the end of chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, you shift to kind of life after Babel, life after languages have split and people have gone their own way. And with chapter 12, then you are introduced to Abraham. And so that's the same kind of pattern that we get here in this catalog of saints. He's just bringing up the major saints as we find them here in the book of Genesis. So, all right. So by faith, it says, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. All right. So, let's just start with the basics here. Where was Abraham from? That's right.
Okay.
You are. That's the way to spell a name. The Germans will use that catalog, that uh, as a figurehead on some of their words to designate like the original of something. So you might have an history, and that would be kind of an original history as opposed to a history that was, mangled over time. Or an gospel would be kind of the original gospel before, things were edited or changed or things of that nature. So the Germans take up that word in that way, particularly as that's where Abraham begins. So he begins in Ur. He is going to receive an inheritance there. He's got a dad there and a brother. He's also got his wife, Sarai, at the time. But God comes to him. Ur is somewhere, we would say, kind of North Iraq, somewhere that general area, maybe even a little bit further east towards Iran. So not exactly in Israel's neighborhood, but not completely far away either. So, but God comes to Abraham, says, hey, I know you think you're going to inherit from your dad. Guess what? I want you to go to this place you've never seen, maybe even never heard of, this place called Canaan, and I'm going to give that to you. Those of you who are married, if your spouse came to you with that proposal, what are you thinking? Yeah, that would have been a hard one to swallow, certainly. And yet, Sarah also believes the Lord. So trust that Abraham loves her, and just as we would find in Ephesians 5, is willing to give up even life itself for her and for her benefit. He sets aside that benefit he would have received from his father in order to follow the Lord. Being willing, as we see in, like I said, in Ephesians 5, to lift up the care of his wife and future family in order to follow the promises of God. So a wonderful act of faith. And so Abraham travels. He leaves behind a city with rock and stone and foundation, and he goes to this land of Canaan, which then becomes the land of Israel after the Exodus, and the Israelites come and take possession of the land in the book of Joshua. Now he goes out, he didn't know exactly where he was going. He had to listen for the Lord to tell him. So how would you like that one? Where are we going? I don't know. When are we going to get there? I don't know. What do we need? Everything. That's what we need. We're just, how we know when we get there? God will have to tell us. We're just going to keep driving until either the wheels fall off or God says stop. So they do. They also take their nephew Lot. He gets in all sorts of trouble, but he is not included in our memory passage here, right? Because instead, we look at the focus of the faith of Abraham, which then will turn into the faith that he passes down through teaching his children to Isaac and eventually to Jacob. So, all right. So they go. Then we to this place they don't know, but God does tell them, particularly as they get near kind of the area of Shechem, in kind of this mid northern Israel, that this is the place. And so they begin to settle there by living in tents. That would have been a very different lifestyle. Imagine going from your house to living outdoors all the time. It's like Boy Scout weekend every weekend.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. Ken's got the right idea there.
Yep.
Verse 9, by faith he went to live in the land of promise. Okay. So again, it's a land that God had promised to him, but yet it was as a foreign land. Living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. We don't necessarily always think about that, but it may very well be if you kind of line up all the dates and things that, Jacob may have seen his grandfather, Abraham, just a little bit. There's just enough time, perhaps. Uh, no, there's not actually enough time. I take that back. This is an inclusive phrase to say that he lived in tents with Isaac and with Jacob to make the statement that both Isaac and Jacob dwelt in tents, just like Abraham did. Not that they actually saw each other. There we go. Misremembering my facts for a second, having to do the mental math of how old he was. Uh, so now I actually bring that up for a reason. This living in tents thing. Abraham, those of you who, this was a number of years ago now, we were doing through Genesis during the pandemic. So kudos, if any, for those who were here all the way back then, way to go. You're still here. I don't know what that says about any of us, but we're glad that you're here. And do you remember, where does Abraham ever get any land in Israel?
Isn't it just enough to bury his wife?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. When Sarah, it's not until Sarah dies. So they come to this land of promise. Sarah is, let's call her, 75 or so. It seems like Abraham is, I don't have an exact date off the top of my head. Forgive me. I'm still running just a half beat behind with a little bit of lack of sleep. But we know that Abraham will be 99 and having been living in the land for some time when he is going to have, gets the promise that within 1 year he will have the child Isaac, and Sarah is 90. So we know that there's a little bit of time before that they're living in the land. And then Sarah doesn't die until Isaac is 30. Yeah, something like that. So we got a few years where they're living in the land and they don't get anything. So let's call it 30, 40 years. You're just living off of the good graces of your neighbor who's letting you camp out next door or in the backyard. Uh,
Mhm.
so, but yet it's the land of promise, right? It's a land that God promised to Abraham, but Abraham never takes full possession of that promise. He believes, he trusts, he lives in that trust, but he never sees it paid out. Indeed, as Ken said, the one time that he gets some possession is a double cave on the edge of a field in order to bury his wife and eventually for his sons then to bury him. So that's all the land that he gets, just a foretaste of the promise of God. So with that, then um, we find verse 10. All right, because we could ask ourselves, how could you live for 40 years having left all of this behind? Great buildings, air conditioning, being powerful, rich, and now you're going to go live as a Bedouin. You're going to go live as a tent dweller. Um, that doesn't seem like a great investment. Uh, so, what was Abraham looking for? Because he never tried to make this a reality. Verse 10 tells us he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Now, what city has the designer and builder of God?
New Jerusalem.
Yes, the New Jerusalem, not the old one. This
No.
is this is even better than New Coke. All right. This is from
Oh,
this is from the heavenly places themselves, right? So the New Jerusalem will descend, as we've been told, God coming to his people at the last day. So Abraham is looking for that heavenly city. Now that's an important piece for us to be aware of here. Because if I was given a promise, right? I need to go to this place and I need to live in this place because this is the place where God is going to, what God is going to give me, right? This land of promise. I don't know about you, but I think I'd be working pretty hard to make sure that I helped God make that promise happen, right? Like, you're going to give me this land, I'm going to make deals. I'm going to, make sure that, the sheep can do this and my children have that, and, start some of those long-term contracts to, start getting possession of this promise. But Abraham doesn't do that. Right? It's a stark contrast of how we might look at and say, okay, God gave a promise. How do I help make that promise a reality? And what Abraham does, where he simply lives, tries to live faithfully, right? And to then trust that God will bring about exactly what he promised, knowing that God's promises are not earthly, temporal promises in this case, but that this promised land was more than just a place. It was this promise of salvation, this promise of not only a place now, but a place forever. So, uh, so that is a kind of Abraham's wonderful example to us, so that we in this day, as we too are looking forward to this city whose foundations are built by God, its founder, we're looking for that too. And so our job is not to uh, help make God's promises become a reality in this world at this time, but to live in this world by faith, looking forward to and bearing witness to that promise, just like Abraham. Make some sense?
yep.
All right, good. Now we talk about Sarah. By faith, Sarah, and he only refers to her as Sarah. She does get her name changed, just like Abram gets his name changed to Abraham um, after the birth of Isaac. Sarah, she received the power to conceive. By faith, she herself received the power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Right. So because she believed, all right, she was able to have kids. God opened her womb. All right. Uh, that's always one of those, this morning we had just the weirdest discussion in Bible class. People were so desiring to know more about eunuchs, and it was so odd to me. But this is again, this is actually one of those, I would say, kind of similar things, right? That by faith, Sarah herself received the power to conceive. Now we know what has to happen for things to be conceived, right? And that means that at this advanced age, you have a centurion, basically a 100-year-old and a 90-year-old, and they have to be willing to engage in this act. So there's kind of an activity of faith taking place there in probably more ways than one. At least, today we would think about hips and all sorts of medical issues and whatnot, but just kind of okay, great. Uh, it's always one of those moments that are good for us, just like we were reminded this morning with the comments on the eunuch, that this is more than just a simple, okay, I believe. This took a real act of faith because they had to actually engage in things that for 70 years hadn't done anything. And maybe they'd set aside because, well, that time's over. But now by faith, they have to once more step into these promises and do these things, as silly as it may feel. So, all right. So, but she believes just like Abraham did, and by it, she receives a child. And through that child, then will the promise be fulfilled to Abraham. So God works in mysterious ways, and he brings that to bear. And that's verse 12 then. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. All right. So, I mean, if you had any doubt about, what Abraham was like at this age, he's as good as dead. That's
He's
how.
still walking and talking.
What was that?
He was still walking and talking with
I know. I mean,
yeah. That's what it says, though, so we'll leave it there.
exactly. I don't, there's just no Instagram. We don't have, Father Abraham on there showing us how, like our friend Putin is, always able to wrestle a bear at whatever age he is. So we don't have any of that proof. But you can read between the lines as to kind of what is being discussed there. So, and I'll let you do that on your own. But nevertheless, by faith, through this act and by God's power and promise, this one who is as good as dead now brings forth life. How? By acting in faith. And that's a reminder to us that even as we may not feel that we are the most powerful, most prevalent, most able, when the Lord calls his people to be faithful, when the Lord calls you to be his representative, his person in this place, whether that is in ministering to grandchildren or to children, whether that be to be just a Christian presence in a workplace. When God calls us to these things and we do not feel like we are able, again, we look to the example of Abraham and Sarah, who, though they were as good as dead, yet by faith, God blessed that work. Not because it was so powerful, right? But because of God being faithful. And he who calls us is faithful.
That pretty much seems like God's timing since the beginning of time, right? You
Yeah.
want something, you want something, you want something. He's like, no, 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 no. And you're like, fine, whatever. And all of a sudden, boom, you're like, well, oh, I don't know, whatever. It just, he's always had a sense of humor, I guess.
Well, he's always certainly had a sense of humor, and he has a way of, again, not just working in the ways we would expect, but reminding us that he is at work. And then from those stories, forming many of us so that we don't have to go through the same things. Like if we didn't have this story, we very well might, how many would just fall away as we get older and things haven't come to pass. But now we have seen how God has worked in the past, and that serves as an example. It's always good to know the examples, and it always stinks to be the example. Right? None of us want to be the one by which other people learn.
You're right.
That's something I often share, particularly with those who are near the end of their life that are maybe, say, in a hospital. I get that question fairly often, right? Why is God keeping me around? As if they have some magical purpose that if they do this one thing, then all right, they check the box and God will let them die, right? No, but my answer to them is not just to poo-poo on that, but to rather give the examples like Abraham and Sarah. Perhaps you are here to be an example of what faith can be like. You don't have to be the mean old person that the nurses all hate and have been talking about since we've gotten here. You can be that kind person. You can show them that a follower of Christ doesn't have to be a punchline and a joke, but rather someone who can actually care for them, pray for them, minister to them, even as they're being ministered to in health. So all of those are kind of good examples that we learn from Abraham and Sarah.
Well, along that
Yeah.
line, we have a niece who is a PA now, and when she was working in the hospital, she was cleaning up the bodies of those who had passed.
Okay.
She was very surprised that some people had a very peaceful expression on their face, and others had a terror on their faces when they died.
And they knew the Christians were dead.
And
The
she
Christians had a good-
she was pretty sure that the ones with the peace were Christians.
Yeah.
So that was a very curious observation.
That's a very good observation. Absolutely. We who die in faith and do not need to die in fear of what is coming, but rather in the comfort that we go to be with the Savior. And that's a kindness and a joy.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Yeah. Share that with others. You don't have to die in fear. I mean, Christianity has so many good bumper sticker like moments. I know that, you know, sometimes it feels like we just say the same things and it can get boring in church and whatever, but we've got some really cool bumper stickers and things like you don't have to die afraid, you know,
Right.
death
Yeah.
is the end. There's a life beyond. I mean, Jesus loves you. I mean, these are all good things. So maybe not all perfectly the exact same, but all right.
Really good around Halloween. Okay.
There you go. So 13, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Well, okay. So they had not received. Let's just think about Abraham and Sarah here. These could mean also some of the descendants and things, but we'll just kind of leave that off for a second. They had not received them, but how did Abraham and Sarah see them from afar and greet them from afar? What do you think that phrase is meaning or trying to get at?
Well, they saw the promise of the son, that they were going to have a son. That
Okay.
happened.
Yeah.
So the promises were being fulfilled.
Okay. Good. Great. Yeah. That's exactly it. They had seen the promise from afar. Not that they had somehow a mystical vision of, oh, one day there will be this thing, right? But rather that, just as you've said, through the answer of this immediate promise that they would have a child, they saw the fulfillment from afar. They saw that this is the first step in that greater fulfillment of God's promises. Jesus will say of Abraham that he rejoiced to see my day, right? And how did he see this day of Jesus? Through his son, through Isaac, who was born as this new carrier of the promise, and as that first step of God bringing about exactly what he had promised to Abraham. So great job with that. Very good. I thought we were going to have to go around and round. There it is. Just excellent. All righty. So again, Sarah and Abraham, they are strangers, exiles on the earth. Again, they aren't possessing any of the land. They're not looking to hold on to or carry any power or authority in this world. Just kind of hanging out, waiting for God to work, trusting that God will. And so 14, for people who speak thus, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. 15, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. 16, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Okay. So again, if they, this would be Abraham, Sarah, and to a degree their descendants, if they had been thinking of a land, or they're seeking a homeland, right? They had left Ur. They went to this place where God had said, I will give you and set my name. This is going to be the land of promise. They're seeking a homeland based not in temporal authority or temporal possession or economy, but rather in the promises of God. And so that's the homeland they're looking for, is a homeland of God's promise. If they had been thinking of a land, that's what 15 is all about, they would have just gone back. If they were just looking for a place to get powerful, right? A place to have stuff, they would have gone back home to Ur. Would have all worked out. But instead, we see they remained in the promise. They kept trusting God, which itself is another wonderful testimony of faith, right? If you had a ripcord to be able to pull and be like, I'm going back. Like, how long would you stay in the wilderness waiting? Still hasn't given his promise. We're here 30 years. I've gone to Egypt and back. We've had all sorts of problems. Like, wouldn't you pull the ripcord and just be like, I'm going back to Dad's house? Like, I'm going back to where it was set and settled, nice and easy. There's a great temptation there. And it's a wonderful example, again, of the faithfulness of Abraham to the Lord's promise. And an example for us then to learn and follow as well.
Well, going back, I don't know, might have some drawbacks if it's full of people like Brother Laban or something, you know. You couldn't trust him any further. You could throw a pig.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. You know. Well, anyways, no, it's good. God's promises.
Yes.
But that's unusual language in 16.
Yes.
God is not ashamed to be called their God.
Uh-huh.
That's different. Well, we know that he's got plans and he doesn't change them at will. So.
Uh-huh. All right. So here we want to kind of fill out what is the author meaning by that God would be ashamed to be called their God, particularly because he has prepared for them a place.
Right.
Okay. This is really affirming a contrarian position that God takes up in relation to the way the world looks at people. Okay. When a government looks at its citizenry, it wants to be proud of them, right? It wants them to be upstanding, to be powerful, to be rich, right? This is why we make rankings. This is why, you know, the United States likes to say, you know, we have the greatest army, or we used to, you know, rank really high in math and science and, you know, things of that nature, all of that stuff, right? Because we want to be proud of the citizenry. If your citizens don't have any permanent land, don't have a lot of stuff, are weak, vulnerable, right? Getting moved around by all sorts of natural, that's not a great citizenry, right? That's not something that you're gonna, I mean, if you had to pick, I want the guys living in tents versus the guys that founded Rome, which one are you taking? Right? I want the guys with the aqueducts. I want the guys that know how to, you know, wage war and have, you know, beautiful language and all sorts of thought. You'd be, you know, if you're gonna come into, you know, you imagine, you know, these kind of two gods and they're bringing their people and it's like show and tell, right? And one guy comes in, he's like, look at all the stuff I have, you know, look at, yeah, maybe this and that, you know, do you guys ever have show and tell, right? Anybody ever bring in like the same thing? I remember first grade, we used to be able to take Legos in to show and tell until the Legos got too big. And we were told, you know, that we were wasting too much time. But like, you know, one kid would bring in, you know, whatever his parents bought him, you know, this $1 billion Lego thing, right? And then the next kid would come in, you know, and it was just something he built out of, you know, spare parts and chewing gum that he liked. Who's embarrassed about what they have? The second guy, right? Because in comparison to the $100, $1 billion, whatever Lego, I mean, mine is just cruddy compared to his. And that's the example here then, that what we're hearing from the author of Hebrews, that even though to the world, Abraham, those who follow him, the Israelites, they're nothing. They're not great, not like the Greeks, not like the Romans, not like the Chinese, not like the Americans. I mean, they're not any of these, great nations. And so, God would rightly be ashamed of their failures, their faults, their lack of great accomplishment. But he's not ashamed. He's not ashamed because he has prepared the answer to their faith. He has prepared what they are hoping for. So he's not ashamed because they trust him and he will fulfill that promise. So he's not looking to the same things the world is looking at. He's rather looking to faith, and he is not ashamed because they believe in him, and in that he rejoices. So that's what this is getting at there. All right. So not a looking at their works or something like that, but rather simply looking at the fact that they are being faithful. So go ahead. Ruth, in the book of Ruth, we also hear something very similar to this. It says that the Lord is proud to be their God because of their faithfulness, because of their faith. So just kind of a nice little bit of an homage there. So good. On to 17 then we go. Again, dealing with this faith of Abraham. By faith, when he was tested, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him. All right, this is the fourth example of Abraham's faith. So just kind of a number of somewhat temporal completeness. It'll be the last one that we get with Abraham, and we'll call it the culmination act, right? Once God had delivered on his promise, giving Abraham this son, God then, and we know the story, Genesis 22, God says, now I want it, and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. I want you to be willing to let go of this child, to let him die, and it die because you trust me. That's a heck of a lot of trust.
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, that's a lot of trust.
There doesn't seem, and this is with these kinds of moments, this is one of those things that there doesn't seem to be a lot of good that can come out of this one, right? What good comes out of Abraham fulfilling this command? He shows his faithfulness, but Isaac is dead, right? There is nothing good for Abraham here. There is only that the Lord is, that there is one who honors the Lord and is faithful to him. That's the only benefit. Right? There's no temporal benefit to Abraham. There's no physical benefit to Abraham. Abraham and Sarah, we know what the divorce rates are, and they're even worse when there's a death of a child. They're almost 100%. So, I mean, that marriage would have been kaput at that point. It would not have been good. But in this way, this promise and this request of the Lord upon Abraham does parallel both the temptation in Eden and Christ in the garden. And I lay it out in this way. So in Eden, God gives all sorts of fruit and food and trees and things for Adam and Eve to eat and drink and have fun with, right? You can eat any tree in the garden. You can do anything you want, right? Take care of the garden, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay. Now, as we hear from what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil can do, right, it's useful for making one wise. It is beneficial. It does a whole lot of things, right? If you kind of look into Genesis 3 there, what this tree does. And so what's the benefit of not eating from the tree, which would tell you kind of where right and wrong, and where those limits really are. And, what is the benefit of not being as wise for the Lord as you could be, and not as strong and as powerful and as able? Where's the
Yeah, but
benefit in what was
They
that?
had they had daily talks with God. What more can you have?
Well, I hear you, Dave. I hear you, Dave. And on the other side of things, right, when you don't have that, that seems like, yeah, that should have been enough. But when we're in the midst of something and we don't realize that what it might be like to not have something, um, we can often understand, what that would be like, to not realize that something could be lost, and what that would mean. So C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, I believe, but certainly in his Space Trilogy, plays up on this, and really lays it out pretty nicely, that this command in the garden, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of all the commands that God gives, every one of them in creation is beneficial to the individual, right? Every one of them. Have a good family, don't kill people, right? Don't steal stuff. I mean, we go through the Ten Commandments, they're all beneficial, except for this commandment. There is nothing that the individual who does it gains from it. It is simply an opportunity to show that there is obedience, that there is trust, that even though I don't get anything from it, I trust you, right? And Abraham here is then asked to do the same thing, because Abraham gains nothing except to show that he trusts. And so it's very similar to where Eve failed and where Adam failed. Here, Abraham has succeeded.
Well, okay, the knowledge of good and evil gives the authority in the world to Satan, and now you're in the middle between God and Satan, and that doesn't turn out so prettily.
No, no,
It's a
it's
struggle. But I know what you're saying. The grass is always greener, and that's
well,
our fallen
yeah.
nature.
So I mean, we could come up with an argument for, how Satan might have convinced Eve, apart from just did God really say? I mean,
Yeah.
you can run through the same, to an argument there. And certainly the world is different post that occurrence. So if God had not commanded it, that it not be eaten, then Adam and Eve could have eaten it, and it would not have, had any kind of spiritual shifting of authority. But when God says don't, that's the issue. So, okay, Christ himself also follows this pattern with his time in the garden during his Holy Week experience. When he's there in the garden praying, Father, take this cup from me, right? Again, there is no benefit to Christ personally to go to the cross and die, to do the Isaac thing. But he does it out of obedience, right? In an even greater way than Abraham, who trusted that, all right, I'm going to obey God, but I'm pretty sure he's going to give me this kid back because this was the promise. Christ here lays down his own life, not the life of anybody else. So even a greater faith and a greater obedience. All right. Now, this verse, by the way, Hebrews 11:19, he considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, which figuratively speaking, he did receive him, because he basically assumed Isaac was dead, is one of the quote unquote proof texts for the Israelite faith. That is, we don't get a lot of doctrinal works that get passed down outside of the Hebrew scripture as to what people believed, say Abraham. But here it seems like this passage helps us to understand that there was a belief in the resurrection of the dead. Right. And we saw that, we talked just a little bit on it with the Enoch passage earlier in this listing, where Enoch walked with God and was no more, giving an indication that death is not the intended end of men, but rather that they be with the Lord. And so those who had died at some point need to be brought up to be with the Lord, to be raised up. And so Isaac then becomes part of that example, and Abraham believes in that same way. So the belief in the resurrection, my whole point in saying it, belief in the resurrection is not a New Testament only thing. It does exist in the Old Testament and in Israel's faith walk. There we go. I know I have a shirt that said drink local, but this is just key lime water. So
Key lime. There's no key limes in Michigan.
It's pretty fermented. isn't
Lime
it?
and the coconut.
Not a drop of key lime in that.
It comes from Florida by way of Madison Avenue.
This contains 0% juice.
0%. There you go.
It's just carbonated water with some citric acid. All right. Anything else there from Abraham? All right, we transition then here at verse 20 away from Abraham and to Isaac. And we only get, whereas Abraham, we had all these verses, 4 different examples of faith. Isaac, this middle patriarch, so the patriarchs of Israel are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This middle guy, Isaac, he only gets 1 verse. So his verse goes like this: by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Okay. So this is the first example. We'll see this of Isaac. There will actually be 3 examples that will get of faith in Abraham's descendants. Again, Abraham is given to us as the prime example of patriarchal faith. He got 4 examples of his own. His descendants only get 3 in total. So the author here of Hebrews just kind of focusing us on Abraham and then kind of just quickly moving us forward in history. So he evoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Who remembers when that happens?
When Jacob went in and tricked his dad.
Yeah, that's the moment. That's a strange thing to say, that by faith, when Isaac was tricked by Jacob and deceived, he invoked future blessings. Right? It's strange to say it that way when we know the story from Jacob's perspective. But if we pause for a moment and we put ourselves in the shoes of Isaac, who is older, who is not able to see as well, right? Who, in a good construction upon his sons, doesn't believe they're going to, try and steal each other's birthrights and things, right? What son would do that? What child would do that? So Isaac here, acting in faith, when one of his sons comes, he wishes to give him his birthright and to issue those blessings. Apart from anything that may have happened beforehand or any of the deception of Jacob, Isaac is acting in faith, even as Jacob may have been faithless in his stealing of the birthright. But Isaac still believes and still is trusting that as he received the promise from his father Abraham, that God would bring about salvation, that he would bless this lineage in order to bring about a savior, so he would pass that blessing on. And he does, first to Jacob, as Jacob deceives him, and then to Esau. These are not equal blessings. All right, Jacob gets everything. Esau gets next to nothing. Esau gets a blessing that you'd rather not have. All right, his blessing is something like, you're going to live hand to mouth, you're going to fight everybody, and life is going to be terrible for you. This is what God has given to you. Thanks, Dad. You could have kept that one in the tank. Just like next time, just nothing.
Well, Esau kind of headstrong, went off and married some local girls too. They were not part of the
Oh yeah, this was,
big family. So yeah,
you're absolutely right. You're
he's a
absolutely right.
rebel.
Particularly post, so the marriages of Esau, we find, I believe, just after this kind of leaving of Jacob. Esau decides
Yeah.
to,
All
yeah,
right.
once Dad doesn't give him a good blessing, he decides to put the screws to Mom and Dad, and he gets married to all these Canaanites and other horrible women and things. So actually, that's happening basically in the same time period. So we understand Esau is not a good guy,
He
and
was
that's,
up,
yeah.
well, Jacob wasn't so good. Jacob was just following his mother's direction. Huh? Oh, yeah. Never mind.
There are things to be said there, and there are things to be said. So
It just goes on.
yes, it does. Yeah, there's all sorts of family dynamics. The Old Testament is wonderful. encourage people as you have opportunity to read through the Old Testament, certainly do, seeking, God's will, seeking that God might speak through it. But as you have occasion, just to take some of these stories and to kind of put your old, high school English literature cap on, where your teacher would say, why is this door brown? And you have to come up with some kind of an idea why a door might be brown versus black versus blue, right? Just do some of that analysis, do some of that engaging of, well, what? All right, so Jacob is following his example of his mom. Why would they highlight it in that way? What's going on there? What is this power dynamic that's being at play? What is this human story that's occurring? It adds just a wonderful depth to the story, not just to teach us a spiritual truth, but to show us that these truths are cemented, they're foundational to how life goes. So, good.
Well, God in his wisdom can bring wonderful things out of the worst situations, I guess, too.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. The deceiver becomes he who struggles with God in Israel. So, all right. So by faith, Jacob, this is 21. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. All right. So Jacob does actually bless all of his sons, but particularly he blesses the two sons of Joseph, who will take possession of portions of the land of Israel, even as the Levites will not take possession of the land. They don't get land, so to speak. They get a couple of cities and things, but they don't have their own kind of territory. And there's no territory of Joseph. So you get Ephraim and Manasseh being kind of these two tribes. Do you have something, Karen?
And worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff is how it's said in my Bible.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
What is he doing?
Yes. What is he doing? It's a very odd moment, right? So Jacob is the way that the story really sets itself up in Genesis. I want to say it's 49 or maybe it's 50. It's one of the two last chapters there. Jacob is dying. He's basically bedridden. All right, unable to kind of stand up at all. But the staff is a symbol of power, authority. It's also how you get out of bed to get to the chamber pot and things. All right, so he has this thing, this moment of support, and he sits up basically in bed and calls Joseph and his sons in. Joseph puts his two kids, his oldest one, Manasseh, on dad's right side, so he'll get the better blessing, right? And then Ephraim should get the lesser blessing because he's the younger kid. Dad reaches his hands out, does one of these things, all right? And Joseph takes his hands off, says, no, Dad, you've got the wrong kids, right? Puts his hands right, and then Jacob, again, sits it the way he wants. Again, making a nice little sign of the cross, inverts the blessing, just like we saw with Isaac and with Jacob, carrying that tradition. But with that, he then not only offers a blessing, but in kind of holding his staff, he does bow down and he actually leads the family in this kind of moment of worship. That's really kind of where that blessing is coming from. The reason for its inclusion here, that bowing in worship over the head of his staff, that Jacob is not able to offer a blessing of his own power or his own volition, but rather it is an affirming and a giving of this promise through faith in the Lord. Right? So all the blessings that Ephraim and Manasseh receive, they only receive through the promise of God. It's really a way of kind of connecting it back to that same promise that was given to Isaac, it was given to Abraham. Because Abraham, again, couldn't give blessings to his son Isaac, aside from the blessing that God had promised, that there would be this Messiah, they would have a great nation. And again, Isaac, the same thing. He gives it to his children, not in his own authority or by his own power to make these things happen, but out of a promise and a worship of the Lord. And so the same then here, as they are, I think one of the reasons for it made explicit here in bowing in worship or worshiping, kind of putting his head over leaning over the head of his staff, is because now they're no longer in the land of promise. Now they're in Egypt. And so here now that Moses makes explicit that this promise is not by their power, but it's going to be by God's power that these things will come to pass. So he leads in a little worship. There you go.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah. And let's just finish up Genesis here with verse 22. All right. So by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. This is one of the first will and testaments we get in the ancient world that we're aware of anyway. Joseph gives explicit directions, as does his father, Jacob. Jacob says, do not bury me here. You take my bones back and you put them back with my dad and my grandpa. So that's where he wants his bones. That's where Joseph will want his bones as well, back in the promised land. So this is when Joseph makes mention of the exodus of the Israelites, he does not make mention that they are going to be enslaved. He doesn't make mention that they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. He doesn't know that. But his mention of the Exodus is that God will take you from here and will lead you back home to this land of promise. Joseph, as powerful as he is, right? We remember that he was sold by his brothers, right? Bought by Potiphar, accused of an attempted rape, thrown into prison, eventually lifted up by the Pharaoh. To manage the economy of Egypt during the 7 years of famine. Joseph then becomes incredibly powerful and makes the Pharaoh incredibly powerful because he takes all of the land, all of the animals, and all of the money of the people of Egypt. So they all now work for the Pharaoh. Except for the people that are his people who live up in Goshen because they're shepherds and the Egyptians hate shepherds, so they just leave them alone. So Israel is really, really quite a powerful little moment there. But even in all that power, being number 2 in all the land of Egypt, Joseph is not free. He's still a slave. He's number 2 in all of Egypt, but he's still a slave to Pharaoh. He's never made more than that. He's never granted his freedom. He's granted a wife. He has kids, right? But he's not made free. He's not able to just leave Egypt and be like, like we would today, right? The vice president could say, I'm out. Okay. Can't imagine that happening, but maybe it could, where vice president just says, you know what? I'm done. I don't want to be here anymore. I'm going back to the farm in Virginia. And they're free to do that. Joseph was not. He had to have special permission to go to bury his father Jacob in Israel, and he had to return, and he was not allowed to leave. And so he tells his children and all of the children of his brothers that when the Lord leads them all out, because he won't be leading them, but when the Lord leads them out, take his bones with them, because he doesn't want to be buried in this foreign place, which itself is an analogy that he doesn't want to be forever enslaved, but wants to again return to the land of promise. And that's how the testimony of the saints ends with the dealing of Genesis there in 22. So we will pick up next time with 23. And I don't see a pen handy, so I'll have to make that note. Here we go. I have colored pencils and things all over this house. Do you think I can find them? All right, so we'll pick up at 23 next time. Not quite just 7 verses, but a few more. Not by much, but just a few. And we'll get into Moses. Moses will take us a little while, and then we get into basically all of the Old Testament at that point. Things just kind of very fast cascade from there. So, all righty.
All right.
Appreciate y'all. Yeah, have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.
And-
Thank you.
and I-
Yep.
you-